Clark Granger had told every soul in Dusty Creek, Texas, the same thing for 3 years running, and he meant every word of it. The only woman he would ever marry was one who came with land. Not because he was a cold man, though plenty of folks in town had taken to calling him exactly that. Not because he had a heart made of saddle leather and creek stone, though his foreman, old Pete Dawson, liked to joke that the Almighty had forgotten to install the softer parts when he was putting Clark together. No, Clark Granger had made his declaration about land and marriage because he had watched his father work himself into an early grave on soil that wasn't big enough to sustain a proper cattle operation, and he had decided, somewhere around the age of 22, that sentiment was a fine thing for poets and preachers, but a ruinous thing for ranchers. He was 26 now, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his work shirts and gray eyes the color of a coming storm. He owned the Granger Ranch, 412 acres of decent grazing land in the hill country just north of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882. He had a good herd, a solid house made of limestone and cedar, 2 good horses named Buck and Temperance, and a reputation that stretched from Dusty Creek all the way down to San Antonio as a man who knew cattle, knew land, and did not engage in foolishness. The foolishness he was most careful to avoid was romantic entanglement with women who had nothing to bring to a partnership. He had watched his neighbor, Roy Tillman, marry a lovely girl from Austin with nothing but a pretty face and a kind heart, and within 5 years Roy was selling off sections of his ranch just to keep the household going, because the operation wasn't large enough to turn the kind of profit that a family required. Clark was not going to let that happen to him, so he had his rule, and he stated it plainly whenever Mrs. Hargrove at the general store started looking at him meaningfully over the dry goods counter, or whenever Reverend Michaels mentioned, with perhaps slightly too much casualness, that the Hendersons' eldest daughter was of marriageable age. "I'll marry for land," Clark would say, not unkindly but with the finality of a man closing a barn door against a storm. "When a woman walks up to me with a deed that makes my operation worthwhile, I'll consider it. Until then, I've got cattle to tend." The town had long since stopped trying to argue with him. By 1882, Clark Granger's stance on marriage had become one of Dusty Creek's minor legends, the kind of thing the old men at the hardware store brought up when conversation ran dry, shaking their heads and wondering aloud whether a man that set in his ways deserved to find happiness at all. It was a Tuesday in late April when everything changed, though Clark did not know it yet, when he rode into Dusty Creek to collect a wire that Pete said had come in from a land agent in San Antonio. The morning was sharp and clear, the kind of spring morning in central Texas that felt like a promise, with the cedar trees releasing their pollen in pale yellow clouds, and the mockingbirds running through their entire repertoire of stolen songs. Clark tied Buck to the rail outside the telegraph office and pushed through the door, nodding to Emmett Hale, the telegrapher, who was a small, nearsighted man with spectacles perpetually threatening to slide off the end of his nose. "Morning, Mr. Granger," Emmett said, already reaching into his pigeonhole. "Got 2 for you, actually. One from that land agent in San Antonio and one that came in this morning from a Miss Abigail Grady out of Laredo." Clark frowned. The name meant nothing to him. Abigail Grady. "That's what the wire says." Emmett handed both slips across the counter. "She's asking if she can come speak with you about a mutual matter of business. Seems she sent it addressed care of the Dusty Creek postmaster, so she knows you're here. She just doesn't seem to know you personally." Clark took the wires and stepped outside into the sunlight, squinting down at the one from Abigail Grady first. It was brief and businesslike. She was the daughter of the late Thomas Grady, who had died the previous February, and she had come into possession of his Laredo holdings and wished to speak with Clark Granger about a proposition of mutual benefit. She would arrive on the Thursday stage if he was amenable to a meeting. She signed it simply A. Grady. Clark stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, reading the wire twice. Thomas Grady of Laredo. He knew the name, knew it well. Grady had been one of the most significant ranchers in Webb County, a man whose spread along the Rio Grande had been talked about in land circles for decades. If this woman had inherited Thomas Grady's land, then she had come into something substantial. He folded both wires and put them in his shirt pocket, untied Buck, and rode back toward the ranch, turning the matter over in his mind with the same deliberate patience he applied to every decision that came his way. By the time he reached the Granger ranch, he had decided to send a reply telling Miss Abigail Grady that Thursday was acceptable. What he had not decided, and what he would not fully reckon with for some weeks yet, was that the very deliberate, practical nature of her approach, a woman who sent a telegram about a business proposition rather than arriving at his doorstep with a pie and expectant eyes, had already impressed him in a way he was wholly unprepared for. Thursday came in off the San Antonio road on a warm afternoon, with a wind that smelled of rain somewhere to the southwest. Clark had ridden into town to meet the stage, not because he was eager, he told himself, but because good manners required it. He stood near the stage depot in the shade of the depot's overhang, Pete Dawson beside him chewing on a length of dry grass and pretending not to be deeply interested in the whole affair. The stage rolled in with its usual complaints of wheel and leather, raising a respectable cloud of caliche dust before it lurched to a stop. 3 passengers stepped down. First, a traveling salesman Clark recognized from previous visits, a round little man with a case of patent medicines. Second, an older gentleman in a good suit, who had the air of a banker or attorney. Third, a woman who stepped down from the stage and set her boot heels on the Texas dust, as if she had every intention of leaving a permanent impression. Clark's first clear sight of Abigail Grady was something he would carry for the rest of his life, though in the moment he was careful to keep his face absolutely neutral. She was 23 years old, and she was not soft in the way that women who had grown up in town were soft. She was slender but strong, the kind of lean strength that came from outdoor work, with a straight posture that spoke of a woman who had learned early that the world would not accommodate slouching. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up under a practical hat that had seen real weather, not the decorative sort that city women wore. Her eyes, when they found his across the space between them, were the clear, direct brown of creek water over smooth stone, and she looked at him without flinching or fluttering, simply measuring. She wore a traveling dress that was good quality but not fussy, and she carried a leather satchel herself rather than waiting for the stage driver to hand it down, which told Clark something about her before she said a single word. "Mr. Granger," she said, crossing to him with her hand extended in the frank, businesslike manner of someone who had learned to shake hands with men and mean it. "Abigail Grady, I appreciate you agreeing to the meeting." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Miss Grady, welcome to Dusty Creek. This is my foreman, Pete Dawson." Pete touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. Dawson." She glanced around the town with the appraising look of someone cataloging her surroundings, and then she turned back to Clark. "I imagine you're wondering what exactly I've come to say." "The thought had crossed my mind," Clark said. "Then perhaps we could find somewhere to talk if you're willing. I've taken a room at the hotel, so there's no urgency on that front, but I'd prefer to have the conversation sooner rather than later. I've traveled 2 days to have it." Clark nodded toward the hotel at the end of the main street. "Mrs. Hargrove's establishment has a sitting room. She lets it out for business meetings when the occasion calls for it." "That will do fine," Abigail said. They walked the length of Dusty Creek's main street together, Pete diplomatically falling behind to give them space, and Clark was aware of several pairs of eyes following their progress from the hardware store and the barber shop and the window of the general store where Mrs. Hargrove was already positioned, pretending to straighten a display of canned goods. Mrs. Hargrove met them at the hotel door with barely concealed curiosity burning in her eyes. "Mr. Granger, what a pleasant surprise. And you must be the young lady from Laredo. I'm Dorothy Hargrove. Your room is all ready, dear." "Thank you," Abigail said, with the kind of polite warmth that was genuine but also clearly indicated she was not here for social pleasantries. Mr. Granger mentioned the sitting room might be available. Of course, of course. Mrs. Hargrove led them through to a small, clean room furnished with a settee, 2 chairs, and a table near the window. "I'll bring coffee." "That's very kind," Abigail said. When Mrs. Hargrove had gone, Abigail set her satchel on the table and sat in one of the chairs without waiting to be invited to do so, which Clark found he respected. He took the chair across from her. Outside the window, the main street of Dusty Creek continued its afternoon business. Horses hitched at rails, a freight wagon rumbling past, the distant clang of the blacksmith at his work. "I'll say what I came to say plainly," Abigail began, folding her hands on the table, "because I suspect you're a man who prefers plain speech." "I am," Clark said. "My father died in February, Thomas Grady. I don't know how well you knew him." "By reputation," Clark said. "I knew he had a significant spread along the Rio Grande in Webb County." 840 acres, Abigail said. Clark kept his face still. That was a considerable statement. 840 acres was more than twice what he owned. "He left it to me in its entirety," Abigail continued. "I'm his only surviving child. My mother passed when I was 11. I grew up on that ranch. I know cattle, I know land, I know what it takes to run an operation of that size." She paused, and something shifted slightly in her expression, a flicker of something honest and unguarded beneath the businesslike manner. "What I don't know how to do is hold it." "What do you mean, hold it?" Clark asked. "In Texas in 1882, Abigail said, "a woman alone does not hold 800 acres for long. I have my father's foreman, a good man named Ruiz, and I have a small crew, but there are neighbors on 2 sides who have been making offers on sections of the land since before my father was cold in the ground. One of them, a man named Gerald Whitmore, has been less than gentlemanly about the whole affair. He seems to believe that a woman without a husband has no real claim to land regardless of what the deed says." Clark's jaw tightened slightly. He knew the type. "Has he done anything unlawful?" "He's moved his fence line 3 times, Abigail said. "He's threatened 2 of my hired hands. He's spoken to the county clerk in Laredo about the validity of my father's will, trying to find procedural grounds to contest it, though his attorney apparently told him he had no case." She looked at Clark steadily. "He hasn't done anything I can bring before a judge yet, but he will. Men like Gerald Whitmore don't stop." Mrs. Hargrove appeared with coffee, and there was a brief pause in which cups were distributed and the door was closed again. Clark wrapped his hands around his cup and watched Abigail across the table. "I'm going to ask you something directly," she said, "and I want you to understand that I've done my research before asking it. I've spoken to people who know your reputation. I've spoken to a land agent in San Antonio who has dealt with you. I know what kind of man you are, or at least what kind of man people believe you to be." "And what kind is that?" Clark asked. "Honorable, practical, fair in your dealings. A man who says what he means." She picked up her coffee cup. "I've also heard that you've stated on more than one occasion that you won't marry unless there's land involved." The directness of it hit him like cold well water. He said nothing for a moment, holding her gaze. "That's been said about me," he agreed. "Well," Abigail said, "I have 840 acres and a herd of 460 longhorns, which I believe is more than twice what you currently own, and I'm here to propose a marriage that would be, at its foundation, a business arrangement." The silence in the sitting room was absolute except for the distant sounds of Dusty Creek going about its afternoon. Clark set his coffee cup down on the table with great care. He looked at this woman who had traveled 2 days to make him a frank proposition, and who had not once batted her eyes or mentioned her own feelings, or tried to appeal to anything other than practical reason. He thought about 840 acres along the Rio Grande. He thought about the 2 of them combined owning over 1,200 acres, and a merged herd that would make them one of the most significant operations in that part of Texas. He thought about Gerald Whitmore, whom he had never met but recognized instantly as a particular species of land-hungry bully that he despised. He also thought, though he did not fully acknowledge it to himself in that moment, that he had never in his life sat across from a woman who made him feel so immediately and completely as if he was talking to an equal. "A business arrangement," he said. "At its foundation," she said. "I'm not so cold-blooded as to think that's all a marriage should be. I'm not proposing that we treat each other like strangers with shared property, but I think it's better to be honest about the practical reasons than to pretend they don't exist." She met his eyes. "I need a husband who can stand beside me when Gerald Whitmore tries to take what's mine. You need land that will make your operation something worth building toward. Those are honest reasons. I'd rather start from honest ground than from pretense." Clark leaned back in his chair and spent a long moment studying the woman across from him. She did not squirm under the examination. "You said you came here after doing research," he said finally. "Then you must know I'm not an easy man." "I know you're a serious one," she said. "I'm a serious person. I think that might work in our favor rather than against it. You'd be leaving your home in Laredo." "My home is under threat in Laredo," she said, and for the first time there was a thin edge of feeling in her voice that the businesslike manner didn't quite cover. "I don't want to leave it, but I don't see a way to hold it without help. And I'd rather seek out a partner than wait around for Whitmore to wear me down." She looked at the table for a moment, then back up at him. "My father built that land from nothing. He started with 40 acres and a small herd when he was a young man, and he spent his whole life building it into something worth passing on. I'm not going to let some land-hungry bully take it because I happen to be a woman." Clark felt something shift in his chest. He could not have named it precisely. It wasn't the 840 acres, though he would have been lying to say the land played no role. It was the way she talked about her father's work, the way the practical exterior had cracked just slightly and shown him something real underneath. "I'll need to see the deeds," he said. Abigail reached for her satchel, opened it, and set a leather folio on the table. "I brought them." He looked at her for a moment before he opened it, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. It was brief, barely there, but she caught it. "Of course you did," he said. He spent the better part of an hour studying the documents while Abigail sat quietly across from him, neither hovering nor withdrawing, simply present. The deeds were in order. The land was real, the title clear, the herd documented. Thomas Grady had been everything his reputation said, a careful man who kept meticulous records. When Clark set the last document down, he looked up to find Abigail watching him with an expression that was careful but not entirely without hope. "I'd like a day to think on it," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'd also like to ride down to Laredo and see the land myself before any decision is final. That's not a matter of distrust," he added. "It's just how I make decisions about land." "I'd expect nothing less," she said. "And I'd want to see your land before we reached any final agreement either." He nodded. "That was fair. You'll stay in Dusty Creek through the weekend." "I've taken the room through Sunday," she said. He stood and she stood. They shook hands again, and this time the handshake lasted a fraction of a second longer than it strictly needed to, or perhaps that was simply the weight of what they had just discussed making the moment heavier. "Miss Grady," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said. He walked out of the hotel into the spring afternoon with his mind turning over everything she had said, and found Pete Dawson leaning against the hitching post outside, still working the same piece of dry grass and looking at nothing in particular with the studied innocence of a man who has been absolutely eavesdropping. "Well," Pete said. "She's got 840 acres, Clark said. Pete let out a long, low whistle. "That's something." "Yes," Clark said. "It is." He rode back to the ranch that evening in a thoughtful silence, and what he was thinking about was not only the land. The following morning, Clark sent Pete over to tell Miss Grady that he would take her on a tour of the Granger spread if she was willing, and she arrived at the ranch gate at 8 in the morning on a horse she had hired from the livery stable that she handled with an easy competence that told him she had spent a great deal of her life in the saddle. He rode with her across every section of the Granger property, showing her the grazing land, the water sources, the limestone bluffs to the north that made a natural windbreak, the winter pastures, and the section along the eastern boundary that he'd been slowly improving over the past 2 years. He watched her eyes as they rode, the way she assessed the grass and the soil, and the fencing with the appraising look of someone who actually understood what she was seeing. She asked good questions. Not polite questions designed to appear interested, but real questions that showed she understood cattle operations. She asked about his water rights and the reliability of the creek through dry summers. She asked about his relationship with his neighboring ranchers. She asked about his debt situation, which was a bold question and which he answered honestly, because she had a right to know and because he found he was incapable of being anything other than direct with her. "Free and clear," he said. "I don't carry debt. It was one of my conditions for expansion. I'd rather grow slowly than borrow against what I have." She nodded as if this confirmed something. "My father was the same way." They ate a midday meal at the ranch house that Clark's housekeeper, a capable woman named Maria Cortez who had worked for the Granger family since Clark's father's time, put together with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Maria did. Abigail thanked her in Spanish, which Maria received with visible approval and a warm smile that she did not extend to many visitors. After the meal, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the spring warmth and drank coffee and talked, not about business this time, but about the things that had made each of them who they were. Clark told her about his father's small ranch and his father's death when Clark was 19, and the years of work it had taken to get the Granger ranch to where it stood today. He told it without self-pity, but without false modesty either, and she listened the way serious people listen, without filling the silences with unnecessary words. She told him about growing up at the Grady ranch, about riding the range with her father from the time she could sit a horse, about learning to read cattle the way other girls learned to read music. She told him about her mother's early death and the particular kind of growing up that resulted from being a girl raised primarily among ranch hands and cattle drives. There was no bitterness in how she told it. If anything, she seemed to feel that her unconventional upbringing had given her something rather than taken something away. "I know some women would find this proposal strange," she said at one point, looking out across the pasture where Clark's herd grazed in the afternoon sun. "Coming to a man I've never met and proposing a marriage on practical grounds. I find it sensible," Clark said. She looked at him sideways. "You find it sensible?" There are worse foundations for a marriage than mutual respect and an honest accounting of what each person brings to it. "There are," she agreed. "I've also known people who married for nothing but feeling and found that feeling alone doesn't hold a household together when the drought comes." Clark looked at her. She was looking at the cattle, her profile clean and composed against the afternoon sky. He was aware of a sensation that he would not yet have called longing, but which was something in that general direction, a pulling kind of attention that made him want to keep the conversation going past whatever its natural end might be. "I'll ride down to Laredo next week," he said. "If the land is what the deeds show, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then I think we should talk seriously." She turned to look at him then, and something in her face was more open than it had been in Mrs. Hargrove's sitting room, more uncertain, which paradoxically made her seem more real. "And if we do talk seriously," she said, "I want to say something before we go further." "Go ahead," he said. "I told you this would be a business arrangement at its foundation. That's true. But I don't want it to only be that." She looked back at the cattle for a moment before returning his gaze. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Granger. I'm not expecting that. But I am hoping that whatever we build it as real partners, that you respect my judgment about the land and the cattle because I've earned that respect, not because you're being generous, that you speak to me plainly, the way you'd speak to any person you considered a real equal." Clark was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been, and something in it had moved beyond careful. "I don't think I would be able to speak to you any other way," he said. They looked at each other in the afternoon light. Two serious, practical people standing at the edge of something that was larger than either of them had planned for, and neither of them looked away. He rode to Laredo the following week. It was a 4-day journey on horseback, down through the hill country and south through the brush country toward the Rio Grande, and it was a journey Clark found himself making with a sense of purpose that went beyond the professional. He reached the Grady ranch on a Thursday afternoon and was met at the gate by a lean, sun-weathered man of about 50, with a thick mustache and sharp eyes, who introduced himself as Ernesto Ruiz, the foreman. Ruiz shook his hand with the evaluating firmness of a man deciding quickly whether another man was worth his time, and Clark apparently passed the test because Ruiz's expression shifted from assessment to cautious welcome. "Miss Grady sent a wire that you were coming," Ruiz said. "She asked me to show you everything." "I appreciate that," Clark said. What Ruiz showed him over the next 2 days was more than everything he had seen in the documents. It was substantial and it was real. The 840 acres stretched along the Rio Grande in the particular way that Rio Grande land did, with river bottomland that was rich and dark, good for both cattle and agriculture, rising to rougher brushland behind, with good water access that Clark, who had spent years worrying about water through dry summers, recognized as enormously valuable. The herd was healthy. The fencing, though in need of some repair on the western sections, was generally sound. The ranch house was larger than his own, a low, sprawling adobe structure that had been added to over the decades as the Grady operation grew, surrounded by mature cottonwood trees along the creek that ran through the property. On the second afternoon, riding the eastern boundary with Ruiz, Clark saw firsthand what Abigail had meant about Gerald Whitmore. The fence line on the eastern side had clearly been moved, and not subtly. There was an old post line still visible in the ground some 30 yards east of where the current fence ran, and when Clark pointed it out to Ruiz, the foreman's jaw set in the way of a man who has been restraining himself for months. "He moved it twice while Miss Grady was making the arrangements to travel to Dusty Creek," Ruiz said. "Third time was last week. I moved it back the second time, but he moved it again before the fence posts were even dry." "Has anyone spoken to the county sheriff?" Clark asked. "Sheriff Brennan is a fair man," Ruiz said carefully, "but he's also a man who is careful about getting between two significant land operations. He came out, looked at the old post holes, told Whitmore to move the fence back to the original line. Whitmore did it while the sheriff was watching and then started moving it again the next day." Clark looked at the fence line and felt a cold, steady anger that was different from the hot kind, more useful in the long run. "Who else has Whitmore gone after?" "There's a small operation to the south, a family called Benitez, about 60 acres along the river. He's been squeezing them for 2 years. They've sold off 3 separate sections just to get him to leave them alone." Ruiz's voice was flat with controlled disgust. "The Benitez family has been on that land since before Texas was Texas. And he's taken 30 of their 60 acres one small piece at a time." Clark filed this away. He rode the rest of the eastern boundary in silence, and when they turned back toward the ranch house he had made his decision, though he would not present it as anything other than what it was, the product of careful thought and honest assessment. He rode back to Dusty Creek the following week with the Rio Grande land mapped in his mind and a certainty in his chest that had both practical and less practical origins. Abigail was still in Dusty Creek. She had extended her stay at the hotel, though when Clark rode in on a Friday afternoon and found her at the general store examining a catalog with Mrs. Hargrove hovering nearby like a determined satellite, she said only that she had some business to attend to in town before returning to Laredo. He dismounted, tied Buck to the rail, and said, "Miss Grady, could I speak with you?" She closed the catalog and turned to face him. Whatever she read in his expression told her something, because her own expression became very still, the kind of stillness that is not absence of feeling but the conscious containment of it. "Of course," she said. Mrs. Hargrove watched them walk out of the store together with the expression of a woman who fully intended to have something to talk about at Sunday supper. They walked to the end of the main street where a bench sat in the shade of a cottonwood near the bank, and they sat down together with 6 inches of proper Texas space between them. The afternoon was warm and smelled of cedar smoke and horses, and the mockingbirds were at it again overhead in the cottonwood's branches. "I rode the whole property," Clark said. "Every section." "I know. Ruiz sent me a wire." "It's good land," he said. "The river access alone is worth more than people in the hill country can easily imagine. The herd is healthy and well managed. Your foreman is an excellent judge of cattle, and a man who's been loyal to that operation for a long time." "Since before I was born," Abigail said. "I saw the fence line on the eastern boundary," Clark said, "and I heard about the Benitez family." Something passed across Abigail's face at the mention of the Benitez name, quick and complicated. "They've been our neighbors since my father's time. He helped old Mr. Benitez repair his barn after a flood in 1871. Their son, Miguel, grew up riding alongside me on the range." She looked at her hands in her lap. "What Whitmore has been doing to them is wrong. It was wrong before it was my problem, and I said so to my father, and I say so now." "I intend to address it," Clark said. She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that, when we present a united front as a married couple operating that ranch, I intend to make clear to Gerald Whitmore that the days of moving fence lines are finished, and I also intend to look into what can be done about the land he's taken from the Benitez family, because there may be legal remedies that Ruiz and your hands didn't have the resources to pursue alone." Abigail stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's not why I came to Dusty Creek. I didn't come here to ask you to fight my fights." "I know that," Clark said. "You came here to propose an equal partnership. I'm telling you what I plan to bring to that partnership, which includes not tolerating injustice toward our neighbors any more than I'd tolerate it toward us." She was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him, there was something in her eyes that was warmer and more unguarded than anything he'd seen there yet, something that had been carefully managed up until now beginning to show itself. "Mr. Granger," she said. "Given what we're discussing," he said, "I think you might consider calling me Clark." The faintest color rose in her face. "Clark," she said, "are you saying yes?" "I'm saying yes," he said, "if you're still asking." "I'm still asking," she said. They looked at each other in the shade of the cottonwood while the mockingbirds cycled through their borrowed songs overhead, and Clark Granger felt something unlock in his chest that he had not known was locked, a loosening of some careful defensive structure he'd been maintaining for so long it had started to feel like his natural state. "I think," he said slowly, "that I should also tell you something honest." "Please do," she said. "When I agreed to this meeting, it was the land that interested me. That's what I told myself. 800 acres and a practical woman who understood business." He paused, looking across the street at the hardware store where 2 old men were sitting in chairs watching the world go by. "But sitting on that porch with you last week, talking about your father and your ranch and the way you grew up, I found myself thinking about considerably more than acreage." Abigail was very still. "Is that so?" she said quietly. "I don't say that to complicate things," he said. "I say it because you asked for plain speech and honest ground, and that's what I'm giving you." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, and the expression on her face was one he would spend years trying to find adequate words for, something soft and surprised and wondering, underneath which was something older and more careful that was just beginning to trust that wondering was safe. "I appreciate that," she said, "more than you know." They agreed to marry in 3 weeks' time, which was practical given that Abigail needed to return to Laredo to deal with the ranch affairs, and which was also about as long as either of them felt they could reasonably wait once the decision had been made. Clark rode to Laredo with her when she went back, and they spent those 3 weeks doing the real work of merging 2 operations, discussing with Ruiz and Pete what the combined arrangement would look like. working through the legal papers with an attorney in Laredo named Caldwell, who was a meticulous man, and who drew up a marriage contract that Clark signed without hesitation, because it treated Abigail's land as her land, not something that became his by virtue of the marriage, but something they would manage together. It was Abigail who noticed Clark reading that particular clause carefully. "You don't have to sign that," she said. "The law gives you rights to the land regardless." "The law," Clark said, "is not always the same thing as what's right. You built this into the contract because you wanted a partner, not an owner. I respect that." He signed his name. "Besides, I have no interest in holding something over your head. That's not the kind of partnership I want either." Abigail took the contract from him, and for a moment her hand covered his on the paper, brief and warm, before she stepped back. "No," she said softly, "it's not." They married in the small Catholic church in Laredo on a Saturday in late May of 1882, a straightforward ceremony performed by Father Morales, who had known Thomas Grady, and who looked at Abigail with the particular gentleness reserved for those he had watched grow up. Clark's foreman Pete came down from Dusty Creek, accompanied by Maria Cortez, who cried through the entire ceremony, and afterward declared that Thomas Grady would have approved, which was perhaps the most meaningful thing said all day. Ruiz stood beside Abigail, having taken it upon himself to serve in the role of her family representative, and when he shook Clark's hand after the ceremony his grip was firm and his eyes were serious, and he said, in English and then in Spanish as if he wanted to be certain of being understood, "She is the best thing her father ever made. You take care of that." "I intend to," Clark said. Ernesto Ruiz looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then we will get along." The reception was a modest affair at the Grady Ranch house, attended by the hired hands and by the Benitez family, Miguel and his parents and his younger sister, who arrived with a gift of a hand-embroidered tablecloth that his mother had made herself, and which made Abigail press her lips together to hold back something that threatened to break through the composure she'd been maintaining all day. Miguel Benitez, a young man of about 20 with serious eyes and an easy, genuine smile, shook Clark's hand and said, "My father says you're going to help us with the fence situation." "I'm working on it," Clark said. "My father says you're a good man," Miguel said. "I'm inclined to agree, though I'll reserve final judgment for another year or so." Clark smiled at that. "That's reasonable." The first genuine difficulty of the marriage arrived, as first difficulties often do, not in the form of the obvious threat they had both prepared for, but in a smaller, more personal friction. 3 days after the wedding, Clark and Abigail were going over the ranch accounts together at the large desk in Thomas Grady's study, which had become their shared office, and Clark made a suggestion about the management of the eastern pasture rotation that was directly at odds with how the Grady operation had always handled it. Abigail listened to his reasoning, considered it, and said, with the careful patience of someone trying very hard to be fair, "I understand your reasoning, but I've watched this land through 4 seasons of drought and 1 flood, and the rotation my father established works for the particular conditions along this part of the river. I'm not saying your method is wrong on its own merits. I'm saying it's wrong for this specific land." Clark sat back and looked at her. She met his look directly, neither backing down nor escalating, just holding her position with the same steady quality she brought to everything. "Tell me about the 1877 drought," he said. She told him, in detail that was specific and grounded in observable fact, about the way the eastern pasture held up when other sections failed, the particular characteristics of the soil composition, and the way the shade from the mesquite stands affected moisture retention, the lessons that had been learned through painful experience. By the time she was finished, Clark understood both that she was right about the rotation and that he had walked into this marriage with a habit of assuming his own experience was the definitive kind, and that that habit was going to cause real problems if he didn't address it. "You're right," he said, "and I should have asked before proposing changes." Something shifted in her expression, a releasing of a tension she'd been holding. "I wasn't expecting you to say that," she said. "Did you expect me to argue? Most men would have," she said, "even the good ones." "I told you I wanted an equal partnership," he said. "That means when you know something I don't, I learn from you. It goes both ways. You can feel free to argue with me when I'm wrong." "I already did," she pointed out. He looked at her for a moment and then laughed. A real laugh, sudden and uncalculated, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and she felt the warmth of it somewhere in her chest, that particular warmth of discovering that a serious person has a laugh worth hearing. "You did," he conceded. "And you were right. Let's keep doing it that way." The matter of Gerald Whitmore had not resolved itself with the wedding, as Clark had known it wouldn't. If anything, news of the marriage seemed to agitate Whitmore further, which Clark had also anticipated. The man was the kind of bully whose aggression increased when he felt a target was about to slip away from him. 2 weeks after the wedding, Clark rode over to the Whitmore ranch on the eastern boundary with Ruiz beside him, and a folded copy of the original survey documents tucked in his jacket. He had sent a note ahead, because surprising a man with a violent temper on his own land was unwise, and Whitmore was apparently expecting them when they arrived at the gate. Gerald Whitmore was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had since been rearranged by years of its owner's bad temper and poor character. He had 2 hired men standing behind him when Clark and Ruiz rode up, which Clark noted without surprise and without alarm. "Granger," Whitmore said. He didn't offer a hand. "Come to welcome yourself to the neighborhood. Come to have a direct conversation," Clark said. He dismounted and handed Buck's reins to Ruiz without taking his eyes off Whitmore. "The eastern boundary fence gets moved back to the original survey line by the end of this week. The land east of that line is Grady land, now Granger land, and we will be surveying it with a certified surveyor from Laredo within the next 30 days. I've already retained the surveyor." Whitmore's expression went through several changes. "Now you listen here. I'm not finished," Clark said, not raising his voice, which was somehow more effective than raising it. "If the fence moves again after it's put back, I will bring the matter before the circuit court with the survey documentation and the testimony of Mr. Ruiz here, who has been observing and documenting these incidents for the past year and a half. I will also speak to Sheriff Brennan about the pattern of harassment, because there's a point at which what you've been doing becomes actionable." He paused. "This is not a threat. It's a clear statement of consequences, so there's no confusion." Whitmore's face had gone a particular red. "You've married that woman and now you think you can. The land belongs to Abigail," Clark said. "I'm just making clear that she has full support in defending it. Now the fence, end of the week." He remounted, and he and Ruiz rode back toward the Grady ranch without hurrying, and Clark kept his back straight and his pace even because he was aware that Whitmore was watching and that how you rode away from a confrontation mattered. Ruiz rode beside him for a while without speaking and then said, "That was well done." "He'll test it," Clark said. "Yes," Ruiz said, "but now he knows what the test will cost him." The fence stayed put. The surveyor came from Laredo the following month, and the official survey confirmed the original boundary line to the letter. Clark filed the survey with the county recorder in the presence of Whitmore's own attorney, who had apparently advised his client that proceeding further was inadvisable, and that was, largely, the end of Gerald Whitmore as an active threat. The matter of the land taken from the Benitez family was more complex and took longer, but Clark had engaged attorney Caldwell on that issue as well, and over the course of the following year and a half, they assembled enough documentation about the coercive nature of Whitmore's fence-moving tactics and the conditions under which the Benitez family had sold those sections, including testimony from the Benitez family and from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment, to bring a case before the circuit court. The judge, a dry and careful man named Harrison who had seen land disputes of every variety, ruled that 2 of the 3 sections had been sold under circumstances that constituted coercion and ordered their return. Old Mr. Benitez came to the Grady ranch on the day the ruling was handed down and stood in the kitchen talking to Abigail and Clark for an hour, alternating between English and Spanish. And when he left, he took Abigail's hand and held it in both of his and said something to her in Spanish that Clark didn't entirely catch, but which made her eyes fill with tears. She quickly blinked away. What did he say? Clark asked later when they were sitting on the porch watching the evening come in over the Rio Grande. He said that my father would have done the same thing, Abigail said, and that he believes my father sent me someone who understands what's worth fighting for. Clark was quiet for a moment. The river glittered in the last of the light, and somewhere in the distance a quail was calling. Your father sounds like he was a good man, Clark said. He was the best man I knew, she said. Then she looked at Clark, and the way she looked at him was different from how she had looked at him in Mrs. Hargrove's sitting room in Dusty Creek on that spring afternoon 3 months ago, different from the careful, measuring look of a woman making a calculated decision. This was something else, something that had grown in the space between all the conversations and the shared work and the arguments settled honestly and the laughter discovered unexpectedly. Until recently, she said. Clark looked at her. I'm not saying that to be flattering, she said. I'm saying it because it's true, and you told me to say true things. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she let him, turning her hand so their fingers interlaced. The warmth of that, the simple warmth of a hand held in the evening, was so uncomplicated and so deeply good that neither of them said anything for a while. The summer of 1882 was a genuine education in what it meant to build something with another person. Clark had been a solitary operator by nature and by necessity, a man who made his decisions alone and implemented them through hired hands whose input he valued in a practical sense, but who were not partners in any real meaning of the word. Now he had a partner, and the experience was alternately exhilarating and deeply humbling. He learned things from Abigail that he would never have learned any other way. She knew the Rio Grande land with an intimacy that only came from childhood, from having ridden it in every season and every weather, from having learned it alongside a father who had taught her to read the land the way other fathers taught their children to read books. She knew which sections flooded first in a high-water year and which held their drainage, which mesquite stands provided the best wind protection in winter, which sections of the brushland could be cleared and turned to productive grazing without disrupting the watershed in ways that would cause problems downstream. And she learned from him, absorbing his knowledge of the hill country practices and the different approaches to water management and herd rotation that he had developed through years of working land with different characteristics. She asked questions without embarrassment, considered his answers without automatic acceptance, and pushed back when she had reason to, all of which Clark found he valued more with each passing week. They argued. Not in the corrosive way that couples argued when they were fundamentally misaligned, but in the productive way of two people who both had strong opinions and weren't willing to subsume those opinions for the sake of easy peace. These arguments were always about something real, always arrived at conclusions that were better than what either of them had brought to the table individually, and always ended with something that resembled respect, even when one or both of them had been genuinely frustrated. After one particularly vigorous disagreement in late July about whether to take on additional hands for the fall roundup, a disagreement that involved Abigail laying out a financial case that Clark had to acknowledge was thorough and well-reasoned even though he'd been convinced she was wrong when she started making it. He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as the one he wore when something had genuinely surprised him. "You're very good at this," he said. "I've been doing it since I was old enough to hold a pencil," she said. She was trying to sound matter-of-fact, but she was clearly pleased, and she was getting slightly better at letting him see when she was pleased. "I mean all of it," he said. "The accounts, the decisions, the arguments, all of it. I don't think I fully appreciated, even after Laredo, how capable you are." She looked at him for a moment, that considering look she had, the one where she was deciding whether to say the full thing or the safe version of it. She said the full thing. "I've been capable my whole life. Most people have needed time to see it. I'm sorry it took me time," he said simply. She looked at the table and then back at him. "You see it now. That matters more than how long it took." There was something between them in those moments, some warmth and some gravity together, that was building steadily through the summer into something neither of them had put a name to yet, but which both of them knew was there. They had maintained a respectful arrangement in the matter of the household. The Grady ranch house had enough rooms that they had separate sleeping quarters, which had seemed appropriate given the businesslike foundation of their arrangement, and neither of them had said anything to change it. But as summer deepened into the first weeks of September, Clark found himself increasingly reluctant to say the evening's last good night and go to his room, and he spent more than one morning looking at the ceiling before dawn and having a long, honest conversation with himself about the state of his heart. He was in love with her. Not in the dizzying, impractical way that he had always associated with the word love and dismissed as unsuitable for a serious person, but in a way that was as substantial and as real as the land under his boots, a love that had its roots in respect and its branches in every conversation and argument and shared morning on the porch and evening watching the river, that had been growing since she walked off that stage in Dusty Creek and shook his hand as if she expected to be taken seriously. He sat on that knowledge for a week, turning it over and examining it, not because he was afraid of it, but because it seemed like something that deserved careful thought before he acted on it. On an evening in mid-September, they were sitting on the porch after supper as had become their custom, the river doing its slow work in the fading light, and Abigail was reading from a copy of the Laredo newspaper while Clark sat with his coffee and watched the first stars appear over the brush country. "There's a piece here about the cattle market in San Antonio," she said. "They're expecting higher prices in the spring. That would affect our timing for the sale." "It would," Clark said. He wasn't looking at the stars anymore. He was looking at her. She was reading by the last of the light, her hair partly down from its daytime arrangement, her boots off and her feet tucked under her in the chair, and she looked entirely at ease in a way that she only did in the evenings now, when the day's work was done and they were just two people sharing an end-of-day quiet, and she looked like someone who had made this porch her home. She glanced up and caught him looking. "What?" she said, not alarmed, just curious. "Nothing," he said, and then stopped, because that was the safe version and he had committed to giving her the full version. "No, not nothing." He set his coffee cup on the porch railing. "I want to say something to you." She set the newspaper down carefully. Her expression was attentive and very still. "I know we came into this honestly," he said, "and I know that honesty was built on practical foundations. I'm not saying those foundations weren't real. They were. But something has happened over these past months that I think you ought to know about, because you've asked me to be plain with you, and I mean to be plain about this too." She was watching him with those clear brown eyes, and she was not doing anything to help him with what he was trying to say, which somehow made it easier, because it meant she was going to hear it without shaping it in advance. "I love you," he said. "I am in love with you. Not because of the land, which is a fine thing, and not because you've been a capable partner, which you've been, but because of who you are, which is the most substantial person I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and I wanted you to know that." The silence on the porch was complete except for the river and the insects and the distant sound of the horses in the pasture. Abigail put the newspaper on the floor of the porch. She unfolded herself from the chair and stood up, and she walked the 3 steps between their chairs, and she took his face in both hands the way someone might hold something precious and breakable that they're afraid they'll lose, and she kissed him. It was the first time they had kissed. In the month since their wedding day in the church in Laredo, through all of it, through the work and the arguments and the laughter and the growing closeness, they had maintained the careful, respectful distance of two people who were not sure what the other one wanted, and the kiss, when it finally happened, had in it the force of everything that had been waiting. When she drew back, her hands still on his face, there were tears in her eyes that she wasn't trying to prevent. "I have been wanting to say the same thing to you for weeks," she said. "And I didn't know how to say it without being certain you felt the same way, because wanting something that much is terrifying when you can't be sure it's returned." He put his hands over hers. "It's returned," he said, "more than I have adequate words for." She laughed a little unsteadily, and he stood up from his chair so they were the same height, and he held her the way a man holds a person he has decided he will spend his whole life holding, careful and sure at the same time. Fall moved through the Rio Grande country in a slow, golden progression. The mesquite turned yellow-green, and the cottonwoods along the river went gold, and the herd was fat from summer grazing. And the combined operation of what was now being called the Granger Ranch by the hands and in the county records, though Abigail sometimes still called it the Grady spread with a mix of affection and remembered grief, was going into the winter in better shape than either property had been in on its own. Clark and Ruiz had an excellent working relationship, built on the mutual respect of two men who were both competent and both understood that the other's competence was an asset rather than a competition. Pete Dawson had come down from Dusty Creek to help with the fall roundup, and had decided, with the directness of a man who had worked for the Granger family for a decade, that he preferred the scale of the Laredo operation and would be staying on as additional foreman. Pete and Ruiz, despite being as different in temperament as two men could reasonably be, Ruiz quiet and precise where Pete was voluble and instinctive, developed a partnership that was genuinely effective and frequently entertaining to observe. Maria Cortez had also relocated to Laredo, having declared that she had been feeding Clark Granger for too long to stop now, and the ranch house kitchen under her management became the kind of place that everyone found reasons to drift through at mealtimes. On an evening in October, Clark and Abigail rode the eastern boundary together at sunset, the repaired and properly surveyed fence line running straight and true beside them, the Whitmore land quiet on the other side. The landscape was deep gold and burnt orange in the slanting autumn light, the kind of beauty that the Texas brush country produced only in October, briefly and brilliantly, before the winter settled in. "I want to tell you something," Abigail said as they let their horses walk slow along the fence line. Clark looked at her. There was color in her face that might have been the sunset and might have been something else. "I'm going to have a child," she said. He pulled Buck to a stop. He looked at her for a long moment, reading her face, seeing the mix of joy and uncertainty and hoping and a dozen other things working behind her eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I spoke to the doctor in Laredo on Tuesday," she said. "He confirms it, spring, he thinks, March or April." Clark was silent for a moment. The river glittered in the distance and the horses stood easy in the evening air, and the fence line ran straight and true east through the golden light. "Abigail," he said. His voice had something in it that he couldn't have hidden if he'd tried, a fullness of feeling that came from somewhere deeper than words. "I'm glad," she said quickly, as if she needed to establish that. "I want you to know I'm glad." He reached over from Buck's back and took her hand across the space between their horses, and she gripped his hand back hard, and they sat there in the autumn light on the eastern boundary of what was theirs, and Clark felt as if the world had expanded around him in all directions at once. "A spring baby," he said. "A spring baby," she confirmed, then softer. "He'll have good land to grow up on." Clark raised an eyebrow. "He." "Or she," Abigail amended. "Either way." "Either way," Clark agreed, and he brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, which made her look at him with that warm, wondering look that he lived for, that he would go a long way to earn. They rode home in the evening light with their hands loosely linked between their horses, and the land spread around them in all its fall beauty, theirs and their children's, going on. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a good one, mild enough to avoid the worst cattle losses that bad winters could bring, but cold enough to keep the insects down, and the water levels stable in the river. Clark and Abigail spent those winter months in a domestic closeness that felt to both of them like something they had been working toward without knowing it. A life that contained both the practical daily work of running a significant ranch operation and the warmth of genuine love made by two people who had chosen each other, initially for sensible reasons and subsequently for the best reason of all. They argued about the kitchen garden, Abigail wanting to expand it substantially, and Clark initially questioning whether the labor investment was worth it until she pointed out, with brisk practicality, that feeding the ranch's growing population of hands and their families from the garden would reduce their supply costs significantly, and he acknowledged, again, that she was correct. They discussed the possibility of adding a second structure to the ranch house, as the current configuration was going to be insufficient once the baby arrived, and Pete Dawson was semi-permanently installed. They talked about Dusty Creek, and whether Clark felt the pull of his original ranch there, which he answered honestly, saying that he missed the hill country landscape in the way that a person sometimes missed a thing they'd loved without feeling they needed to go back to it. "We could go up in the spring," Abigail said one evening, her legs stretched out toward the fire, her hand resting on the considerable evidence of the new Granger on the way. "Visit. Let you show me the hill country." "I'd like that," Clark said. He was reading the weekly paper from San Antonio, and he looked up at her over it. "After the baby arrives and you're feeling up to travel." "I'll be feeling up to travel sooner than you'll feel comfortable with me traveling," she said dryly. "Probably true," he conceded. She threw a pillow at him. He caught it. The baby came in the last week of March, on a day when the river ran high with spring rain and the cottonwoods along the bank were just breaking into their first pale green. The doctor from Laredo, a steady, capable man named Dr. Harlan Wells, was there, and Maria Cortez was there, and Clark was in the hall of the ranch house for 4 hours doing something he would later describe as the most difficult thing he'd ever done in his life, which was not being in the room and not being able to help. When Dr. Wells opened the door and looked at Clark and said, "You have a son, Mr. Granger, and your wife is well." Clark had to put his hand against the wall for a moment. He went into the room, and Abigail was lying in the bed looking exhausted and strong in the way she always looked when she'd been through something hard, and she was holding a very new and very small person who was frowning at the world with the concentrated expression of someone deeply committed to his opinions. "Come and look at him," Abigail said. Clark sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and found that after 30-some years of being a person who chose his words carefully and said what he meant and meant what he said, he was at a complete loss for language. "Well," he managed, which under the circumstances was wholly inadequate, and they both knew it, and Abigail laughed, which was the best sound he had ever heard. "He looks like you," she said. "That frown is entirely yours." "I do not frown like that," Clark said. "You absolutely do," she said. "Maria can confirm it." From the doorway, Maria Cortez, who had been standing there for some minutes while nominally giving them privacy, said, "She is completely correct, Mr. Granger." They named him Thomas Clark Granger, Thomas for Abigail's father and Clark for his own, and he entered the world at the Grady Granger Ranch on the Rio Grande in March of 1883, with considerably more to inherit than most people could have planned for. 1,200 acres of some of the best cattle land in southwest Texas, and 2 parents who loved each other, and the land they'd built together with a devotion that was equal parts practical and passionate. In the summer after Thomas was born, Clark and Abigail did make the trip to Dusty Creek, as she had proposed, traveling by wagon rather than horse to accommodate the baby, and the supplies that a baby apparently required in staggering quantities. They arrived in Dusty Creek on a hot July afternoon to the barely contained delight of Mrs. Hargrove, who came out of the general store practically at a run and said, "Oh, let me see him. Let me see that baby." And then spent 20 minutes holding Thomas and informing him of his good fortune in having parents of such excellent character. Reverend Michaels shook Clark's hand with genuine warmth, and then shook Abigail's hand with the same warmth, which told Clark something useful about the Reverend. Old Pete Dawson's mother, who still lived in Dusty Creek, made them supper on the second evening, and declared that Abigail was the best thing that had ever happened to her son's boss, which Pete, sitting across the table, confirmed with a nod that contained a great deal of dignity for a man with cornbread crumbs on his chin. They rode the hill country in the mornings while Maria watched Thomas at the ranch, Clark showing Abigail the limestone bluffs and the cedar breaks and the creek-fed pastures where his father's cattle had once grazed, and where his own first herd had grown, and she looked at it with the same careful, loving attention she brought to everything, seeing what he valued in it. "It's beautiful in a different way than the river country," she said on the second morning, standing on a limestone outcrop above the creek and looking north at the hills in the early light. "More austere, but you can feel why a person would love it." "I did love it," Clark said. He was standing beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "I still do. But not more than you love the river country," she said. "Not more than I love what's in the river country," he said. She turned to look at him, and he saw the thing in her eyes that was always there now, that warm and certain thing that had nothing tentative left in it. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together on the limestone rock in the Texas Hill Country morning, and looked at the land he'd come from and thought about the land they'd built toward. They sold the Dusty Creek property the following year, in the spring of 1884. It was Clark's decision, but he made it after a long conversation with Abigail in which she made clear more than once that she didn't want him to sell it for her sake if it held meaning for him that went beyond the practical. "It held meaning," he said, "because it was what I had. What I built toward was always something bigger. I built toward you, as it turns out, whether I knew it or not." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the coffee cups between them and said, "That might be the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "Don't get used to it," he said. "I've got a reputation to maintain." "The reputation of being a man who married for land," she said, and she was smiling. "And found out," he said, "that the land was the least of it. The proceeds from the Dusty Creek sale went into improvements on the Laredo operation, specifically the new section of barn that had been needed for 2 years, and the updated equipment for the spring roundup that Ruiz had been patiently documenting the necessity of in his quarterly reports. The Granger Ranch in Laredo went into the spring of 1884 as a thoroughly modern and thoroughly solvent operation, one of the most respected spreads in Webb County, run by 2 people who knew every acre of it by heart. The Benitez family was doing well. The recovered sections of land had been replanted and stocked, and the family's herd was growing again. And Miguel Benitez had at 22 become the kind of young man his parents had been trying to raise, serious and capable, and committed to the land with the particular intensity of someone who had once nearly lost it. He worked alongside Ruiz sometimes on the Granger operation when they needed extra hands, and he and Clark had developed the uncomplicated friendship of 2 people who respected each other's work. Old Mr. Benitez came over to the Granger Ranch house one afternoon in the spring of 1884 to bring Thomas a carved wooden horse he'd made himself, a beautiful piece of work, and he sat with Clark and Abigail on the porch for an hour talking about the coming season and the cattle prices and the rainfall. And when he left, he turned at the gate and looked at both of them with the expression of a man pronouncing something that has been settled for some time. "Your father would be satisfied," he said to Abigail in Spanish. "More than satisfied." Abigail took Clark's hand. "I know," she said. "I feel it." In the fall of 1884, Abigail told Clark that Thomas was going to have a sibling, and this time Clark was in the room when she told him, and he didn't need to hold on to anything, just held on to her. Their second child, a daughter they named Elena Maria, after both Maria Cortez, who had been a constant presence in their household, and after Abigail's mother, whose name she'd carried quietly for years, arrived in the summer of 1885. She was a loud, definite person from her very first minutes, and Thomas, who was 2 years old and deeply committed to the idea that the household's attention was appropriately focused on him, regarded her for the first several weeks with the judicious skepticism of someone not yet ready to render a verdict. The verdict, rendered one morning when Clark found Thomas sitting beside the baby's cradle talking to her in the serious, explanatory tone of someone educating a newcomer about the ways of the world, was evidently positive. Maria Cortez told Clark, when he mentioned this, that of course it was positive, that all children eventually came around when they understood that someone new was not a replacement but an addition, and that in her experience, the ones who started out skeptical became the most devoted siblings of all. This proved to be entirely accurate. The years settled into the shape of a life well made, with all the texture that entailed. The hard summers and the wet springs that saved them, the cattle prices that rose and fell and the decisions about when to sell and when to hold, the ongoing work of maintaining and improving 1,200 acres of Rio Grande ranch land, the growth of the children who both inherited their parents' serious eyes and their parents' capacity for argument and their parents' deep love of land. Ruiz retired in 1887 with a small parcel of land that Clark and Abigail had set aside for him when they saw the retirement coming, a section of the eastern pasture close to the river where he had asked if he might build a house and run a small garden and a few head of cattle in his own name. The day they handed him the deed, Ruiz stood very still and looked at it for a long time, and then said, in a voice that was steady with considerable effort, that he had not expected this. "You've given 40 years of your life to this land," Abigail said. "Some of it should be yours." "I always thought of it as mine," Ruiz said. "When your father hired me, I was 17 years old and I had nothing. He treated me like a man of value. You've done the same." He folded the deed and put it in his shirt pocket. "But this is different. This is permanent." "Yes," Abigail said. "That's the point." Ruiz visited them every Sunday for supper for the next 15 years, and the children called him Uncle Ernesto. And he taught Thomas everything he knew about cattle and taught Alina everything he knew about horses. And the parcel of land he'd been given passed eventually to his own daughter, who had grown up and come to the area to be near her father in his later years, and who ran it with the same quiet competence that her father had brought to everything. Pete Dawson married a widow from Laredo in 1886, a capable woman named Constance, who immediately made her presence felt in the ranch operation in 100 useful ways, and Pete settled into Laredo as if he'd been born there. Though he maintained a sentimental attachment to the hill country that expressed itself in an annual trip up to Dusty Creek every October to see the fall and drink coffee at what was now someone else's ranch, and come back saying that it was good country, but Laredo was home. The Granger Ranch grew through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, adding sections as they became available, always carefully, never with debt, in the deliberate way that both Clark and Abigail believed land should be acquired, as the reward for work already done rather than as a gamble on work to be done. By 1890, they owned just over 1,500 acres, and the herd was one of the finest in Webb County. Thomas, by the age of 7, was following Clark around the ranch with the intense purpose of a person learning a vocation, asking questions that occasionally stumped his father, which his father answered by saying, "I don't know. Let's find out," and following through, because Clark had long since learned from Abigail that admitting what you didn't know was a form of respect rather than weakness. Alina, by the same age, had developed a passion for horses that eclipsed her interest in cattle entirely, and which Ruiz encouraged shamelessly, so that by the time she was 10 she was the finest rider on the ranch, and everyone including her father admitted it. On an evening in October of 1892, Clark and Abigail sat on the porch of the ranch house in the warm fall air, which was their oldest habit, the one that had survived every season and every change, the porch and the evening and the two of them with whatever the day had left them holding. Thomas and Alina were both inside, nominally doing the reading that their mother had assigned with the same organized precision she brought to everything educational, actually, based on the sounds filtering through the window, engaged in some debate about something that was becoming increasingly spirited. "We should probably resolve that," Clark said, indicating the window with a slight tilt of his head. "They'll resolve it themselves," Abigail said. "They always do." He looked at her. She was 43 now, still straight-backed and direct, with gray coming into her dark hair in a way that he found entirely beautiful, with the particular quality of a person who had been strong for a long time and had only become more so. The years had deepened everything about her, the competence and the warmth and the sharpness of her thinking and the humor that came out in the evenings when the work was done. And Clark found, as he had found every year, that the version of Abigail Granger sitting beside him in October of 1892 was the best version he had known, which was remarkable given that he had thought that same thing every October. "I was thinking," she said, "about something." "Tell me," he said. "Do you remember what you thought about me," she said, "when I stepped off that stage in Dusty Creek?" He considered. "I thought you were not what I was expecting," he said. "I was expecting a woman who wanted a husband to protect her land. I found a woman who wanted a partner to stand beside her, which was something different." "Were you disappointed?" she asked. "I was," he said, "the most pleasantly surprised I have ever been in my life." She looked out at the river, which was running slow and silver in the October evening, and she had that expression he loved, that quiet, thinking look that preceded the things she said that mattered most. "I was terrified," she said. "I knew how to run that ranch, and I knew how to fight Gerald Whitmore, and I knew how to deal with the legal situation and the financial situation. All of those things I could navigate. But sitting in Mrs. Hargrove's sitting room proposing a business arrangement to a man I'd never met, I was more frightened than I had been at any point since my father died." Clark was quiet, listening. "Not of you," she said. "Of wanting it to be more than a business arrangement. Of coming in with the land and the deeds and the sensible reasons and sitting across from you and thinking, within the first 10 minutes, that I was going to find it very difficult to keep this at the level of a business arrangement." She glanced at him sideways. "You were insufferably appealing in a way that did not fit with my plans." Clark looked at her and felt the warmth that he had been carrying for 10 years gather itself into something that was still, after all this time, almost unbearably good. "Was I?" he said. "The way you read those documents," she said, "careful and thorough and completely honest. You didn't pretend to find things you didn't find. You didn't try to flatter me. You just read them the way a person reads something real." She shook her head slightly. "I'd met a great many men who went out of their way to appear impressive. You were simply yourself, and you were considerably more impressive than any of them." He took her hand. Same as he had on the eastern fence line in that October 9 years ago, the easy interlacing of fingers that had become as natural as breathing. "I should have said sooner," he said, "that the land was never the real reason." "I know," she said. "You said it when it was true. That's the right time." Inside the house, whatever Thomas and Alina had been debating appeared to have resolved itself, because the sound had shifted to laughter, their children's voices bright and easy in the evening air. The river ran on. The cottonwoods dropped their gold along the bank. The herd moved quiet in the south pasture. Clark and Abigail Granger sat on the porch of the home they'd made from land and work and honesty and love, and the evening came on around them in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty, and there was nothing unfinished between them and nothing unresolved, just the fullness of a life that had grown from a practical proposition into the truest thing either of them had ever known. He had said he would only marry for land. She had showed up with twice as much as he owned, and she had also showed up with something he had not thought to put in his requirements. Herself, entirely and honestly, every capable and direct and warm and infuriating inch of her. And in the end, as he had told her on that San Antonio road porch all those years ago, the land was the least of it. The river ran. The stars came out over Webb County, over 1,500 acres of the finest cattle land in southwest Texas, over a stone and adobe ranch house where two children did their reading by lamplight, and a retired foreman sat in the house his employers had given him and looked at the evening, over the fence lines that ran straight and true, over the recovered Benitez land to the south where a family had kept what was theirs, over everything they had built together. Clark Granger looked at his wife in the last of the evening light and found, as he had found every evening for a decade, that there were no adequate words for the magnitude of what he felt, and that she already knew it anyway, and that this, too, was something she had given him, the knowledge that some things were better lived than spoken, and that a person who truly knew you needed neither the words nor the silence explained. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He closed his hand around hers. The river went on to the sea.